How many of you have ever heard that the Ten Commandments were given on Pentecost? You ever heard that old tradition? That's a curious thing in a sense, because how can that be possible? Since as far as anyone knows, the Feast of Pentecost didn't exist. The Feast of Pentecost, per se, was given later than the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments were the first thing God gave to them. So it's very difficult for me to think that the Ten Commandments were given on, quote, Pentecost as such. However, having said that, in Exodus the 19th chapter, there's a story leading up to the giving of the Ten Commandments, and we do know what time of year they were given. And we are in the third month, and verse 1, when the children of Israel were gone out forth out of the land of Egypt, the same day they came to the wilderness of Sinai. And as you study through this whole thing, you find them all getting ready to meet God on a given day. They were supposed to wash their clothes, and they were not to even have relationships with their wives for those times. They were to actually be clean in body, soul, and mind when they came to appear before God on this particular day. And if you read the account, it begins really up in verse 16. It came to pass on the third day in the morning that there were thunders and lightnings and a thick cloud upon the mountain, and the voice of the trumpet exceeding loud, so that all the people that was in the camp trembled. Now, I don't remember when it was. It's difficult for me. It's been a long time ago. But there was an occasion when there was I was present with a crowd, and there was an enormous sound that was involved in it. And I remember in those circumstances having a strange clutching feeling in the bowel, right down the lower part of the pit of the stomach. It was almost as though something really grabbed me down there as a result of the enormous sound, the emotion of the moment, and the power of the situation I was in. And it's really strange. I can remember the feeling, and I cannot tell you what the event was when it took place. But I know the feeling that the people of Israel must have had at the moment whenever God came down, and they were watching there, and there were thundering and lightning and a thick cloud all over that mountain, and the voice of a trumpet. They could hear the trumpet blast extremely loud, the sound of it rolling down that mountainside that was there. And then Moses brought all the people out of the camp to meet with God. And they stood in the nether part of the mountain. And Mount Sinai was altogether on a smoke, because the Lord descended on it. It's incredible to think about. You imagine what it would have been like to have been within the safest possible close distance to Mount St. Helens when she blew. The roar, the sound, the impact of the pressure waves coming off of that thing. And to think in terms of the incredible power of the very presence of God coming into contact with rock and dirt on the top of that mountain. And the impact that had on all the people that were around it, who experienced, in a sense, the presence of God, it's just mind-boggling. And I can kind of understand why they were frightened. I can kind of understand why they wanted to back off from that, and why they really would prefer that Moses speak with God and then come back and tell them. Because coming into the presence of God is really an awesome experience. Awesome experience. Now, there seems to be very little doubt that the day in which God actually took his finger and inscribed the Ten Commandments on the stone tablets was the 6th day of the third month. The third month being named Sivan. And so it was the 6th of Sivan when the Ten Commandments were given to Israel. Now, you would think in the normal course of events that the major event like that would be commemorated by a holy day. That it would be an annual event. In other words, when something like that takes place on a day, that day becomes very important in the nation's history. It's marked on all their calendars, and that is a day that they observe from time immemorial. And so during all the years of the wilderness wanderings, I have little doubt that that was a dominant consideration among the Israelites who were observing, whatever they did observe of what God had given them, whatever they knew about, because I'm not entirely sure exactly at what point in their sojourn that the rest of the law and all the implications of it were handed down to them. But 6th Sivan, that was an anniversary of a particular event like this, would no doubt have gone down in all their religious calendars at that time. What's curious about it is that it didn't make it into the biblical calendar. That when you actually study the Bible to look for the date, that is the instructions to commemorate the date of the Ten Commandments, it's not there. For example, you have the first day of unleavened bread. The instructions on it are explicit. And the 14th day of the first month is the Lord's Passover. And the 15th day of the first month is the day of unleavened bread. 7 days you shall abstain from unleavened bread, because the Lord your God brought you out of Egypt with a high hand. All that stuff is all specified right down the line. And I suppose it's not unreasonable to think that some events in Israel's history would not be commemorated permanently by a holy day, especially if for some reason God only wanted 7 of them, which seems logical in and of itself to be the round number of completion. When you understand how many events there were in their history to commemorate, you know, you have not only the Exodus, you have the crossing of the Red Sea, you have the giving of the 10 Commandments, you have the crossing of Canaan, you have the destruction of Jericho, you have more things in their history from Egypt to the Promised Land than anybody could ever put on the calendar. You'd have no day left to work. So somehow and for some reason, this day of the giving of the law is never mentioned again as a holy day or a calendar day upon which they are doing observance. Now I know that will sound funny to someone who's familiar with Jewish law and what the Jews do, because the Feast of Shavuot, that is the 6th of Sivan, which Shavuot means weeks, the Feast of Weeks is the day upon which they celebrate the giving of the 10 Commandments. And in fact, if you'll go check their websites out, generally speaking, the first thing you find under Shavuot will be the giving of the 10 Commandments. It'll be this long explanation of the giving of the law and all the connections with it. And then somewhere down the line will be, oh, by the way, it is also the Feast of First Fruits. Well, in their tradition, that's the way it has happened, and far be it from me to argue with Jewish tradition for Jews. But if you'll turn back to Leviticus 23, I'd like for us to review the instructions God gave concerning the seasons, the appointed times of God. None of this would prohibit us, I must add, from saying we're going to observe specific incidents in our history anyhow. It wouldn't prevent us from saying we're going to celebrate our independence on the 4th of July, for example. It wouldn't prohibit Israel from celebrating Hanukkah. It wouldn't prohibit them from celebrating the Feast of the Dedication. They can put anything they want to into their civil calendar as far as an observance of something God did for them in their history, right? We all understand one another? What we're talking about here are the appointed times of God, the Moeds, that is the festivals, the holy days that we observe. Now, in the Leviticus 23 is the one comprehensive statement of all these days. And in this passage you will find no instructions whatsoever for the commemoration of the giving of the 10 Commandments. You will not find on the 6th day of the 3rd month, you shall have a holy convocation, you'll all come together and worship me on that day, do sacrifices, because on this day I gave you the tablets of the law in stone. That is not there. But in the process of giving them the holy days, the Passover is given, the days of unleavened bread are specified, the calendar dates for these things are specified. And then when he has done this down through the Passover and the days of unleavened bread, in verse 9, he adds this curiously different festival. He says, "And the Lord spoke unto you, speak to the children of Israel, and say unto them, When you are come into the land which I give unto you, and you shall reap the harvest thereof, then you shall bring a sheaf of the first fruits of your harvest to the priest." Okay? You've got to bring in, before you can harvest, before you can eat, before you can have anything out of this harvest, you've got to cut the first sheaf from the ground, you've got to bring and give that to God. Only when you have given that to God are you allowed to eat anything out of this year's crop. It's easy to understand the symbolism. It's recognizing God, the importance of God, that He gives us every wonderful good gift, and that all this harvest that we're about to take all came from Him, and so the first of it has got to go back to Him. From a harvest point of view, from a worship point of view, all this is abundantly clear. He said, "He shall then take that and wave that sheaf before the Lord to be accepted for you. On the morrow after the Sabbath, the priest shall wave it." Now, there's a certain little ambiguity at that point. When you read right down to here, it leaves you with a little ambiguity, because the first day of unleavened bread is an annual Sabbath. There is also a weekly Sabbath. But there's a problem here. There is absolutely nothing in the account in Leviticus 23 to tie the wave sheaf offering to the days of unleavened bread at all. Nothing. Now, I've heard all my life in the church, I should say, I've heard all my life in the church that, well, the day of the wave sheaf was the morrow after the Sabbath during the days of unleavened bread. Anybody else hear that? You've heard it all the time. It's the morrow after the Sabbath during the days of unleavened bread. However, there is absolutely no expression, that phrase is found nowhere in the Bible. Nothing like it is found anywhere in the Bible. And in fact, when you read Leviticus 23, you will not find one word that ties the feast of this wave sheaf offering to the days of unleavened bread. How did it get that way? Oral tradition. That's not difficult to understand at all. It got tied in there as a result of oral tradition. And there is an interesting little comparison that if you take it from the, if you consider what he's talking about here being the first day of unleavened bread, which is the 15th day of the first month, and if you start your count on the morrow after that Sabbath, you always wind up on the 6th of Sivan. What a marvelous coincidence. And since it is connected with the law, and that fits our tradition, and it fits what we as a people have always done, then we always observe Pentecost, the Jews would say, on the 6th of Sivan. And from their position, from their view of the oral law, from their background and in their culture, they have made that decision, and that's their right to do so. But when you look at the law, you actually look at what it reads. It does not tie it to that at all. Now, the priests consistently did their best to adjust the calendar every year to be sure that the first ripe grain was falling due right about the days of unleavened bread, so that, connected with the days of unleavened bread, they could cut this wave sheaf, offer it in the temple, and so forth. They were very good at that. They planned it out that way. They planted their grain according to that, so they never had to worry about this particular problem as they went along. But there is still this ambiguity. Do we mean the first day of unleavened bread as a Sabbath, or do we mean a weekly Sabbath, as we read through here? You shall offer that day, when you offer the sheaf of the lamb without blemish of the first year, for a burnt offering, a meat offering, 2/10 deals of fine flour mingled with oil, an offering made by fire to the Lord for a sweet savor. And in verse 14, you shall eat neither bread, nor parched corn, nor green ears, until the selfsame day that you have brought an offering to your God. It shall be a statute forever throughout all your generations in all your dwellings. Excuse me, I'm still fighting the allergies from your oak trees up here, I think. Now comes the interesting part of this, because it's at this point that a lot of the ambiguity in the written law disappears. He says, you shall count to you from the morrow after the Sabbath, from the day that you brought the sheaf of the wave offering, 7 Sabbaths shall be complete. Even unto the morrow after the 7th Sabbath shall you number 50 days, and you shall offer a new meal offering to the Lord. Now, the reason why we start running into a problem at this point is because the Jews, having concluded that they want to observe it on 6th Sivan because of its connection with the giving of the Ten Commandments, have decided that what this must mean is that it is to the morrow after the 7th week, not to the morrow after the 7th Sabbath. And so they maintain a certain level of ambiguity in this particular passage. Now, I've looked at this very carefully. I've looked at it as far as I can without the knowledge of the Hebrew language, but I have talked also to very knowledgeable Hebraists, people, to a professor right now who is in the process of doing a translation of the Hebrew Bible for publication, and so that I'll be sure that I know what I'm talking about when I talk about this. And his point was very simple. He believes that the Jews have the right or the authority within their religious community to decide to observe this on the 6th of Sivan, and they necessarily reinterpret this passage with that in mind. But he said, the law, the written law, is explicit. You count from the morrow after the Sabbath to the morrow after the Sabbath, which means there can be no ambiguity whatsoever. The phrasing is the same in both places. It's identical. And since in the second case it can't possibly be the morrow after an annual holy day, it has to be a weekly Sabbath, then it means that the first one also has to be after a weekly Sabbath. Piece of cake, right? Well, I was having an interesting discussion on the forum recently with a gentleman who is very much involved in Hebrew, kind of reads a little bit of Hebrew, and is very much connected to I think did he say his brother was a rabbi, or his friend of his was a rabbi, and read Hebrew fluently. And, of course, he says this should be translated as weeks. Well, I pulled out my trusty computer and looked up every translation that I had, and every single one of them translates it, not weeks, but Sabbaths. I did not have in my computer the Jewish Publication Society version, which probably says weeks at that point. Now, why am I telling you this? Because, in fact, it is a quite legitimate translation of this passage to translate it from the morrow after the Sabbath to the morrow after the Sabbath. It makes all kinds of sense textually. It makes sense contextually. It makes sense historically. And you have to realize that this holy day is really not connected to the giving of the law in any of the biblical typology. Nothing connected with Pentecost, nothing connected with the typology of it. None of that has anything to do with the giving of the law in the Bible. It's just simply the fact that on 6th Sivan, which some years is on that same 50th day, on some of those years, it is the sixth event. And out of that comes this entire deal. Now, I want to digress just for a moment to try to help you understand something. In the law, when you're called for jury duty, depending upon the kind of case that you're going to be judging, you have to judge by two different standards of proof. In our Constitution, you cannot deprive a man of life or liberty except by trial by jury of his peers, and he has to be convicted beyond a reasonable doubt. In other words, all 12 of the jurors unanimously must agree to convict beyond a reasonable doubt. If you have a reasonable doubt, you may believe he's guilty, but you still have a reasonable doubt, you must vote not guilty. Okay? The other kind of case you may be called upon to serve as a jury member on, an attorney was explaining this to us one day. In a civil trial, you are not required to judge beyond a reasonable doubt. You are required to judge on the balance of the evidence at hand. And as he put it to me, he said, once you have got the evidence before you as a jury, if there is one little gram of evidence, one little flake, one little thin paper sheet over here on this side that tilts the balance in the favor of this side, you must decide for that side of the case. In other words, we don't want any hung juries in civil cases. It's a balance of the evidence thing that you're dealing with. Now, this is something which many of us, Westerners don't realize, when we're dealing with theology. That there are a number of cases, a number of things that we study in the Scriptures that we believe we have proved beyond a reasonable doubt. The Sabbath day falls in that category. As far as I'm concerned, I feel that has been demonstrated to me as a member of the jury beyond any reasonable doubt. To me, it's a life or death issue. You can decide on that. I put the holy days in the same category. I have many other things that I would put in the same category. But then we come to a broader range of questions that really we cannot prove beyond a reasonable doubt because there are too many reasonable people who don't agree on it. Follow me? Too many reasonable people don't agree. Take sixth Sivan for Pentecost, or whereas the entire Jewish synagogue and structure of rabbinical Judaism says, no, it's on sixth Sivan. And they are really pretty smart and reasonable people. But on the other hand, there are many other scholars who will look at this, and all the translators of the NIV, the New American Standard Version, the New Revised Standard Version, New King James Version, all say, from the morrow after the Sabbath to the morrow after the Sabbath, which doesn't leave you a lot of wiggle room. And so the fact of the matter is, we have got reasonable people disagreeing on this issue. Now, what you have to do then, as a member of the jury, is you kind of have to decide on the balance of the evidence. Which way you're going to do and what you're going to do. Somebody once wrote to me, we were discussing the question of the Passover, and I'd made my points on Passover timing, the Old Testament Passover, and what we should do in the New Testament. He said, I think the jury's still out on the question of the Passover. I said, okay, but it's got to come in before Passover. The jury can stay out on this question until the Passover, but when we get to the Passover, the jury's got to come in and render a verdict. Because we've got to do it. We actually have to keep it. We have to wash one another's feet. We've got to take the bread and the wine. We've got to do all these things. In fact, we all know that. So we all know we've got to decide. And this is something which we have allowed for far too long to be a problem in the church. And that is the little differences of opinion that we have on things that cannot be proved beyond a reasonable doubt, but which can be established on the balance of the evidence by the jury that's involved in it. And we need to decide these things, and we need to shut up about them and let them go. We've got a history. We've been doing them for a long time. We need to relax. We need to understand that God's grace is big enough to be merciful to us. If when we see the balance of the evidence and we make a decision and we turn out to be wrong on it, at least we did the best we could. I believe that God is very patient with us in that regard, and that He will, in His time, in His way, and His watch doesn't run at the same speed ours does. He'll get around to changing whatever it is needs to be changed when the time comes. But when we get a body of the saints together, and we've studied this thing, and we've worked on it for years and generations, and in my case, it's been some 40 years now that I've been studying these things and working on them. That doesn't make me right, but it does make me a little bit of an authority, I think, that might be trusted and believed up to a certain point. Not that you still go and prove all things from the Scriptures. But the truth is, once you have weighed all this, and in many of these cases, it really depends not only upon how many pieces of evidence you put on either side, but how much weight you put on each individual piece of evidence you're looking at. And it seems to me that we need to have a little more respect for one another and a little more respect for the majority of the saints, because when the majority of the saints have come down on an issue like this after prayer and study and so forth, there's a pretty good presumption that they're right. And it's not something that, that you have to worry that God is going to get you because you got together with some people who keep Pentecost on Sunday instead of Friday. It's just not something God's going to get you for in the course of time. So I think that this needs to be understood, and I think that there needs to be we need to lighten up a little bit, as a matter of fact. And one of the problems that we run into in studying the Bible and dealing with issues like this is the difference that exists between our culture and the culture of the people who received the law originally and of the people who heard Jesus speak when he was actually speaking to them right there, talking to them face to face. The Western mind tends to be afflicted with excessive literalism. And especially true now. It was true really in Christ's day that the difference in the patterns of thought between, let's say, the people in what is now Turkey, Palestine, and East was very different from the patterns of thought, the way in which people evaluated evidence going west. The basic ideas were all the same. But in many areas, people in the West tended to be more legalistic in their approach to things, more law-oriented in the sense the Romans were law-oriented. The Jews were law-oriented, but they didn't look at it quite in the same way. We in our society tend to nitpick because we've got all this stuff written down on paper. In fact, nowadays, if you put something down, and you're writing, let's say, an article for a newspaper or a journal, and you put something in quotes in that article, it had better be word for word correct. Otherwise, you don't put the quotes around it, and you just indirectly quote the person, right? We are so picky that we will jump all over a reporter for putting something in quotes that is not quite correctly quoted. Now, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John knew nothing of this convention. Knew nothing of it. And, of course, when you're dealing with a time when much of it was maintained orally before it was ever put down on paper, you have a different set of problems indeed. And the fact is, you will find as you read through the Harmony of the Gospels that one of the evangelists will record events in the order A, B, C. And you'll read in another one and you'll find he records precisely the same events in the order of A, C, B. Same order of events. Which one of them is wrong? They would think you were crazy if you asked that question. They would say, what's the matter with you? Because in their point of view, what's important is the story. And they were the need for the obsession with accuracy that exists in the 20th century mind would have been they would have thought we were all a bunch of idiots. They probably will when they finally meet us and get a chance to tell us what they really meant by what they wrote down on paper. I can easily see them slapping their forehead and saying, what's the matter with you? How come you can't understand simple stuff? I asked the question once, and some people really got upset with me over it. It was about this sort of thing, and I said, what is the shape of a flock of sheep? Now, you can go up to, some of you guys who are in the military, you could go up and draw lines on a blackboard for us and give us the shape of a company of infantry in parade formation. You could lay it there, draw lines, and you could tell us, hey, this is how they're supposed to form up. You could give us all kinds of shapes of different kinds of things. But if I asked you to draw the shape of a body of sheep, you couldn't do it because it's a blob. It's amorphous. It moves. It changes all the time depending upon obstacles and whatever is in their way. The Eastern mind is like sheep. They think in terms of let's just sort of work our way around the obstacles and get where we're going, and let's not worry about all the details in between. The extreme example of the Western mind is the literalist, and I've heard of two of them in my lifetime, who, having read what Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, because their right hand offended them, they cut it off. Heard of two. They actually, literally took a saw and cut their hand off. Now, this is the extreme example of it. But you see, in the same passage, the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus said, if a man smites you on the right cheek, turn to him the other one also. Now, let me ask you this. In English, in modern English, here we are in the 20th century, we're in the middle America. We can't get any more middle than this. What do you mean if you say to your friend, well, boy, she really did me wrong, but I'm going to turn the other cheek? What do you mean by that? Don't you mean by that, I'm not going to retaliate? Sure you do. That's precisely in our language what the idiom means. Wouldn't it be strange if we learned that that's precisely the same thing that idiom meant to Jesus? That turning the other cheek meant I'm not going to retaliate. It didn't mean that I have to stand there and do nothing while a man rapes my wife. I have to stand there and do nothing while he is harming my children. I have to stand there and do nothing while he beats me within an inch of my life and takes everything I've got. It doesn't mean I can't run away. It doesn't mean I can't put up my arms to defend myself. It doesn't even mean that I can't use force to defend my family. It doesn't mean any of those things. What it means is you're not to retaliate. Now, these things are simple to an Eastern mind. And for people who are sitting there listening to Jesus, they would have understood them that way. Now, that's a digression that I make with you just to simply explain that people, a lot of the people, especially right now in the discussions that go on among church people about different doctrines, we're having a problem because of excessive literalism and the inability of people to think in terms of how would the people who heard Jesus say this have taken it. Now, one of the interesting things, an interesting example of this is found in Matthew 23. If you'll just turn back there with me, I want to show you out of something Jesus said. There are quite a few people who have become convinced that from a Christian point of view, we should observe Pentecost on Sivan 6 because of what Jesus says here. In Matthew 23, Jesus spoke to the multitude of his disciples, saying, "The scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. All therefore, whatsoever they bid you observe, that observe and do. But do not after their works, for they say and do not." Now, what the modern mind thinks about this type of thing, or might think about it, I should say, is that what Jesus intended to do was to establish that in all of the arguments that had raged on in Judaism for generations between Pharisees and Sadducees and Essenes and everybody else, that the group that were right doctrinally, the group that were normative, the group that you were to follow in everything in terms of their doctrines and their teachings was the Pharisees. Have you ever heard that? Probably some of you have heard that. Okay, how would Jesus' audience, though, have thought of this? Now, see, from the Western mind, we tend to think in terms of a central authority, that is a ruling authority somewhere, handing down judgments and rulings and so forth, and that we're all bound by these rulings that they hand down under those circumstances. Well, I was just reading recently in a book called Jesus the Jewish Theologian by Brad Young. He asked us to try to think about what the people who listened to Jesus and heard him say these words would have thought that he meant. And he cited an archaeological discovery of a stone seat that had been discovered in a synagogue. It was really unusual because people, by and large, didn't have individual seating like you've got necessarily in a synagogue. And this was a very elaborate and obviously important stone seat. It was obviously the only thing of its kind that existed in that synagogue. Well, I think I had the wrong angle on this for a long time, because the way I had approached it was, that there is a necessity for judgment in Israel, and that there were people who, when you go to them in court, you would have to listen to, you present your case, they would make a decision, and the decision was binding along the lines of Deuteronomy 17. But after reading what Brad Young had said about this, I realized that that's not really what Jesus is talking about. In their custom and their history, people sat to teach. You sat down in your chair and you taught. It was not standing like I am doing today. Probably the seat was a little elevated where you could see the speaker, but nevertheless you sat to talk and to speak to people. He also cites an archaeological discovery, or not a discovery, but a Jewish tractate that mentions the seat of Moses in the synagogue. And then he tells a story about two rabbis who used to be at such odds. They're both Pharisees, but they were vehemently in argument and debate with one another. And all through their entire lifetime, they never managed to achieve reconciliation on some of the serious discussions they had about the law of God, the law of Moses. And so they would argue back and forth, and debate raged for years in the synagogue. And one of them finally died. And his opponent one day, it tells the story of how he went into the synagogue to the stone seat upon which his opponent had sat and taught. And he kissed the seat, and he mourned the loss of his adversary, because it meant so much to him to have this person with whom he could disagree. Now, knowing this, and with Jesus' audience being aware of this, when he says the scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat, whatever they say to you, observe and do, if it would have been his intent to establish that as the norm, his audience would have said, which Pharisee? Which argument? because there was no single constant argument coming from the seat of Moses in the synagogue. It was the place where rabbis taught, and they taught differing things on the law. They didn't all agree with one another. So Jesus' audience would never have taken his statement as an establishment of a norm, being that you listen to these people. What would they have thought? Well, they could never have imagined that Jesus was passing a general approval on all the teachings of Pharisees, because they fought like dogs and cats from that seat. So there's no real reason why we should ever do that. Then back in Matthew 16, there is this scripture that has to be taken into account. Matthew 16. And we've read this. I'll explain to you what Jesus really meant. In chapter 16, verse 6, Jesus said to them, I want you to be careful and to beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, both of them. And they reasoned among themselves, it's because we didn't bring any bread that he's telling us to do this. And when Jesus perceived that, he says, give me a break. You know, don't you remember how much food I generated out of a few loaves and fishes some little time ago? Don't worry about the fact that we haven't brought any bread. Don't you understand or remember all this? How is it you don't understand that I spoke not concerning bread, that you should beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees? It wasn't about bread. Then they said, a little head slapping going on at this point, forehead slapping. They understood how he bade them not beware of the leaven of bread, but of the doctrine of the scribes and the Pharisees. Now, this being the case, how would Jesus and the people around him have understood what they were talking about? Well, if you understand, again, the shape of a flock of sheep and the fact that we're kind of herding people on to what we want them to understand, his audience would have understood very simply that the point of this was not the first part of it, it was the second part of it. These men are hypocrites. Most of what they would say, he said, you may accept anything they say. You want to look at it as permissive. You can accept anything they say from the seat of Moses in the synagogue, for these people, when they get up there, have got to be serious. They really believe in what they are saying when they speak from that seat. But don't you do what they do, for they are hypocrites. And they say one thing and they do another. He goes on to say, these people will bind heavy burdens, doesn't he? Grievous to be borne, and they won't lift one of them with their little finger. Do you imagine for a moment then that Jesus is endorsing their decisions when he says they bind heavy burdens and grievous to be borne? No. He's just saying, you can listen to their teachings, but whatever you do, don't do what they do, because these people really are hypocrites in the way that they go about this. Now, having laid all that foundation, I'd like for you to turn back with me to the 20th chapter of John. I think that trying to, establish the Sixth of Sivan from Jewish authorities, from the Old Testament, works okay if you are an observant Jew. But if you're not an observant Jew, if your job or your task is that you are trying to find out what God would have us do as Christians, how we should live the Christian life, how we should worship God, how we should follow the law of God, then you have to look at these things from a different perspective. At the Feast of Tabernacles last year, if you didn't hear the sermon, feel free to write and ask for it. The title of my first sermon last year was A Tabernacle for the Sun. And in that sermon, I developed a concept that I think is a little strange to some people, and that is that the meaning of the holy days of God are like the layers of an onion. That it is true that you have the Jewish historical meaning of every single one of the holy days. The Passover pictures the death of the firstborn in Egypt. The days of unleavened bread picture coming out of Egypt and all that's connected with that history. The Feast of Pentecost, the Feast of First Fruits, all these festivals, the Feast of Tabernacles, how you dwelt in booths when you came out of Egypt. All these things are the Jewish historical meaning. And we have also known, though, for a very long time, that there is an eschatological meaning. Eschatological means the study of the last days. So that there are meanings connected with the holy days that have to do with the last days. Or you might call it prophetic meanings of the holy days. We all have known that all along. We have also known that there are soteriological meanings. Soteriology is the study of salvation. And that there are things in the holy days as they picture the salvation plan of God as it works its way out. And so they have that connection with them. They also have a Christology. Christology is the study of Christ. What think ye of the Christ? And it has to do with the work of Christ, the work of his ministry, and the things that he has done historically and will do in the future. And so that for us as Christians, To get hung up on the Jewish historical meaning of these things is a serious mistake. Just as, I think, for those of us who might have come out of another church tradition that kept the holy days, to have had our simple little 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 meaning of the holy days things that we had all tied up with a ribbon and thought we had solved all the problems connected with is silly in the extreme. It fails to recognize the depths and the complexities of God that exist alongside of and beneath and underlying the simplicity of the truth of God. And I think all of us are interested in the deep things of God, the deeper things of God, and those complexities of the things that God is working out. All right, what I'm going to ask us to do is to take a step beyond the Jewish historical and consider the Christian meaning of these days. John chapter 20 and verse 11. The sepulchre has been opened. Jesus is gone. The disciples have come and witnessed the absence of his body. They have gone. Their mouths have been hanging open. They have no idea what's happened. You'd think they would have gotten it, but that's what we think looking back on it from 2,000 years. They were really puzzled. But Mary, in verse 11, stood outside the sepulchre weeping, and as she wept, she stooped down and looked inside. And she saw 2 angels in white sitting, one at the head, one at the feet, where the body of Jesus had lain. They said to her, "What are you doing here weeping? What are you crying for?" And she said, "Well, they've taken away my Lord, and I don't know where they laid him." And when she had said this, she turned back, and she saw Jesus standing. I really think it's, to me it's completely fascinating that of all the people Jesus might have appeared to, it was Mary Magdalene. I think it's marvelous in a sense, because here's a woman who would have been treated as a suspect by an awful lot of people because of her previous demon possession, and there seems to have been a special relationship here. But Jesus said, "Woman, why are you crying?" And she said, "What are you looking for?" And she thought it was the gardener. Looked at him, didn't recognize him, thought he was the gardener, and said, "Sir, if you have borne him hence, tell me where you've laid him. I'll take him away." It was just such a pitiful thing. She says, "Look, if you took him out of here for some reason, just tell me. I'll go take care of it." And then Jesus called her by her name and said, "Mary." And she looked at him and she said, "Master." And a moment of recognition took place that just, sends chills up and down your spine. And then Jesus said, "Don't touch me, for I am not yet ascended to my Father. But go to my brethren and say to them, I ascend to my Father and to your Father, and to my God and to your God." Now, he's not talking about some ascension that is to take place in 40 days. He is saying, you go tell them I'm ascending to my Father, which is in heaven now. He said, don't touch me, because I haven't gone there yet. Some people say it says, don't hold me, but that says the same thing. Don't hold me back. I haven't gone. I've got to get out. I've got to go right now, because I have to be presented to the Father. Okay. Why? What was this all about? Well, according to the law, the previous evening, at sundown, a small procession of men would go down from the temple, winding their way down to a field that had been selected and prepared beforehand. And there they would find, I think, 7 shocks of grain, or barley, that had been tied together in preparation for this event. They had been selected. And they were a noisy bunch of people, because harvest festivals usually are noisy. And they probably had a few wineskins along with them, and a lot of talking going on down there. And they're going down there to initiate the spring harvest by cutting the first sheaf of grain. No one could eat any parched corn, grain, nothing. Couldn't make beer out of it prior to this time. It had to be presented before God. Okay? So they went down to this little field where these were, and the crowd would all gather around, and it was a very festive occasion. And the fellow would have his sequence of questions. He'd shout out to the crowd, and they would all shout back their answers. You'll find this description is marvelous in Edersheim's The Life and Times of Jesus the Messiah. No, I'm sorry. It's in the temple, its rites and services in the time of Jesus. So they would go down there, and he would shout out his question. Is this the place? Yes, everybody would say. And he'd go over and pick out a sheaf and says, this sheaf. And they would all shout back, yes. And he would then finally say, is the sun down? And they would all yell, yes. Why does the sun have to be down? It's work. We don't start the harvest on the Sabbath day. We don't start the harvest until the Sabbath is over. Is the sun down? Yeah. With this sheaf? Yeah. With this knife? Yes. Shall I cut? Yes. And he whacked that from the ground. And you know what? I wouldn't be surprised if that's the moment that Jesus opened his eyes. When that was cut from the ground. It might have been before sundown that he did. I really think that argument is largely irrelevant. But I'll let it ride for the moment. It might have been at that moment. But certainly, then they took this grain over the night into the temple. They beat off the grain from they threshed it, and then they roasted it. They did all the preparation for it, and they brought an omer of it in the next morning into the temple. At about the time that Jesus ascended to the Father, they were in the temple waving the first fruits from the ground before God, and Jesus was being presented to God as the first fruits from the dead. Now, all this happened on what day? Sunday? First day of the week? Yeah. However, there's a curious little thing about that. In the New Testament, you find all these references. First of all, let me just nail down for you a couple of things. 1 Corinthians 15, verse 20. Just a simple verse. But, basically but now is Christ risen from the dead and has become the first fruits of them that slept. Why would he use that expression, first fruits? I mean, why on earth pick that thing out of the sky unless it is the connection of Jesus as being the first fruits of the harvest from the dead. And for his own reasons, Jesus uses this simile or this imagery of harvest again and again, having to do with the work of God of harvesting people from the earth into his family and into his kingdom. So Jesus became the first fruits of them that slept. Later, in verse 23, same chapter, every man in his own order, we're going to be raised. Christ the first fruits, afterward those that are Christ at his coming. So what are we talking about in first fruits? We're talking about the resurrection from the dead. And this entire 7-week harvest festival that culminates in the Feast of Pentecost is the harvest of the first fruits of God's people, who are finally presented before him on the day of Pentecost with in the form of two leavened loaves of bread. Jesus as nothing but grain, no leavening. Us as processed, baked, leavened loaves of bread presented before God as the first fruits of God. James 1 and verse 18, just giving you the single verses. Of his own will he begat us with the word of his truth, that we should be a kind of first fruits of his creatures. Revelation 14:4. Remember those 144,000? That peculiar group of people everybody wonders about? In Revelation 14:4. These are they that are not defiled with women, for they are virgins. These are they that follow the Lamb wherever he goes. These were redeemed from among men, being the first fruits of God and the Lamb. Jesus was the first of the first fruits, the wave sheaf. And then everyone that follows, his children, are first fruits to God. So today is the Feast of First Fruits, the 50th day after the offering of the first fruits and the ascension of Christ on the first day. The first day of what? The first day of the week, people say. But no, not really. Matthew 28, verse 1 is a familiar scripture. In the end of the Sabbath, as it began to dawn toward the first day of the week, came Mary Magdalene and the other Mary to see the sepulchre. Now, I don't have time, nor you have the patience for us to do the word study on this today. But there's one thing that's abundantly clear from this. This is not the expression that any of the evangelists would have used to describe the day after the Sabbath. If they had meant, been speaking of it as a day of the week, they would have said, on the day after the Sabbath, this took place. But why then did they say the first day of the week? The answer is relatively simple. It's not week, it's weeks. On the first day of the weeks. You see, that first day was the day of the wave sheaf. This is the term they used to describe the wave sheaf. The day when the first fruits were presented before God. It's not a day of the week. It's a day of the year. And when people get in this first day of the week argument, and some of the scholars are prone to, they like to throw the first day of the week at how Jesus honored and respected the first day of the week. Hey, it's the first chance he had to talk to anybody. That was the day. And it just happened to also be, and nearly every reference to the first day of the week, I'm going to show you a couple of them that aren't. Nearly every reference to the first day of the week has to do with that one day, that is the first day after his resurrection. So that's not much there. But it is the first day of the weeks, not first day of the week, and it's a reference to the beginning of the wave sheaf, and I'll point that and I'll show you something interesting about that as I go along. Now, if you'll turn back to 1 Corinthians 16, there's another reference that you probably are somewhat familiar with. If you ever attended other churches along the way, like Methodists and Baptists and so forth, you may have seen this verse on the back of a little envelope in the pew in front of you, into which you were supposed to put your offering. 1 Corinthians 16, verse 1. Now concerning the collection for the saints, as I have given order to the churches of Galatia, even so do you. Let me stop a minute. What is the collection for the saints? Well, sometime before, some prophets in the church had said that there was going to be a really serious famine in Judea. And because they believed their prophets, a lot of the Gentile churches said, hey, we've got to get our act together here. We need to send an offering to the poor saints in Jerusalem. Now, there's no need in sending money down there, because in a famine, money's not what you need, food is what you need, right? All this stuff of putting aside gold for the year 2000 problem is a fool's game, folks. What you need for the year 2000, if something bad's really going to happen, is food and water. Gold isn't going to... How many calories are there in an ounce of gold? I'm not in my database. All right, so they were not going to send money, they were going to send food down there. Sacks of grain. Okay, having decided they were going to do that, they made plans and got all their arrangements together. Then Paul says, now concerning this offering, on the first day of the weeks, let every one of you lay by him in store. In other words, the first day of the harvest, when you've got a chance to get out, the first chance you have to put anything away, let's get this offering put aside. So that if you're not going to be out there, I come and you say, oh, I forgot. Let me go in the field and get this ready. No. I don't want it on day 3. I don't want it on day 16. I want you to get out there on day 1 of this harvest and get this thing brought in. It's precisely the same expression, and it's referring to the first day of the 7 weeks that lead up to Pentecost. It is not referring to Sunday morning and the offerings being given in church, because that's not where you're getting this together. You're getting together in the field because you're getting together food, not money. And so that little thing they put on the back of their envelopes is completely and utterly irrelevant to this. Now, I mentioned that every single instance of this in the New Testament had to do with the first day of the weeks, but there is one problem scripture with this, and it's Acts 20, and I want to show it to you because I think in a way, instead of being a problem, it actually nails it down. Acts 20, they're getting it all together. You know, he's on his way, and they're getting this stuff arranged so that they can, he sends actually from Corinth and those areas, he sends off some men with the offering in question, and he heads off in another direction. In Acts 20, he says, after the uproar was ceased, Paul called the disciples and embraced them, and he left to go to Macedonia. And when he had gone over those parts and had given a lot of exhortation, he came to Greece. He stayed there for 3 months. He's down in Corinth at this point. Athens is one place. Greece, and when he says Greece, he's really talking about the Corinthian area. And when the Jews had laid wait for him, he was about to sail into Syria. He said, well, I better not go that way. I better go back through Macedonia. That's a northern route going back through Philippi. And there accompanied him into Asia Sopater of Berea, the Thessalonians, Aristarchus, Secundus, Gaius of Derbe, and Timothy of Asia, Tychicus and Trophimus. These going before waited for us at Troas. And we sailed away from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread. Okay, got the picture time-wise? The days of unleavened bread are over. We sailed away from Philippi and came to them in Troas in 5 days and stayed there 7 days. Days of unleavened bread are over, and 12 days have passed. And upon the first day of the week, when the disciples came together to break bread, Paul preached to them, ready to depart on the morrow. Now, this sounds like a Sunday, doesn't it? For sure. And it seems initially, when you first think about it, to blow the whole argument into a cocked hat, because how can this possibly be day 1 of the harvest when that was supposed to have taken place back during the days of unleavened bread? When you get home tonight, drag your atlas down and check on the latitude of Jerusalem, and find yourself a reference point in the United States that's somewhere about the latitude of Jerusalem. Then take a look at the latitude of Troas, and then bring your map across and run your line across and find out where in the United States the latitude of Troas comes. And you will find that you've got something like a 2-week difference in climate as to when grain would be ripe. How do you know that? Well, I've had enough times in my year, because of the holy days and the way they've fallen, that I've jumped into my car in Tyler and headed north after the days of unleavened bread. Spring gets to a certain point in our part of the world, and I go north. And as I make my way north through those degrees of latitude, I find that people up here are something in the neighborhood of 2 weeks behind us down there. And that's precisely what you're going to find in Troas compared to Jerusalem. About 2 weeks' worth. You'll find differences in that Corinth is a little further south. Corinth is on the coast. Corinth is affected by the sea, which changes the climate. You go on up to the Bosphorus and up to Troas, and you'll find things even different. And if you get inland at all, the elevations get a little higher. So you have the elevation to deal with, you have sea currents to deal with, and you have latitude to deal with. And what you wind up, I think, with in the end is that the first day upon which any harvesting could be done in Troas, the first day of the weeks of harvest, was about 2 weeks later than it would have been in Jerusalem. And so once we still are confirmed with the fact that the meaning of this expression is not the first day of the week. It's not a day of the week. It's the first day of the 7 weeks that lead up to Pentecost, the weeks of harvest. Now, what the Jews did relative to the wave sheaf, what they did relative to Pentecost, I don't really know. I have never had a chance to get into that and do the research on it since I first began to really realize the significance of this first day of the weeks thing. It has nothing to do with Sunday whatsoever. If it did, it wouldn't matter as far as the Sabbath is concerned. But it's not about that. It's about the first day of the countdown to this day that we are here observing today. Regardless of when they offered the wave sheaf in Jerusalem, they couldn't start the 7 weeks of harvest until the grain was actually ready. Now, in conclusion, let's turn back to the 2nd chapter of Acts. Now, remember I said earlier that we have the Jewish historical meaning, the Feast of First Fruits, the Feast of Weeks, and all of what it means. And in Passover, we have the Jewish historical meanings that are there. But we all know that relative to the Passover, we move beyond the Jewish historical and into a Christological meaning, because Christ, our Passover, is sacrificed for us. Therefore, let us keep the Feast of Unleavened Bread, when, not with the old leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. And we easily make the movement from the Jewish historical into the Christological. We all know then also that in our past we had our little list we ticked off. The Passover picture of the sacrifice of Christ, the days of unleavened bread picture putting sin out of our lives, Pentecost pictures the receiving of the Holy Spirit, trumpets the return of Christ, atonement the binding of Satan, tabernacles the millennium, the last great day the great white throne judgment. We had, see how easy that comes off the tongue? I had it memorized real well. And the Feast of Pentecost really does picture the receiving of the Holy Spirit. But that ain't all. It pictures a great deal more than that. And you have to answer these other questions. Jewish historical, Christological, that is the study of Christ and His work, soteriological, salvation history, eschatological, last day significance, and or the prophetic significance that may be connected with it. And there may be more stuff that I haven't even thought about yet in connection with these days. And unless you keep your mind open as you read them, you're going to miss them. If you think you already know that's all there is about it, forget it. You will never find anything else. But if you can just keep your mind open and try to learn as you go along, it's really surprising sometimes what comes to you when you study these. One of the things, for example, in our old sequence of studying these things was that we depended very heavily on the time sequence of events that involved. And so the return of Christ in trumpets, and since we were looking at the time sequence and still looking forward to atonement, the binding of Satan, the millennium, we forgot something very important about Pentecost. If you'll look back at Acts 2, we'll find it. Now, I'm not going to take the time today to go over the questions of speaking in tongues and all that. That's been dealt with pretty thoroughly elsewhere. What I want us to look at, after the speaking in tongues, after all the stuff that's connected with that, I want us to look at Peter's speech that he made on this day, because that is what I think is important. It's in verse 14 of Acts 2. But Peter, standing up with the 11, lifted up his voice and said to them, You men of Judea, and all them that dwell at Jerusalem, and be this known unto you, and listen to my words. These people are not drunk like you think they are. Not at all. This is just the 3rd hour of the day. They haven't gotten started yet. But this is that which was spoken by the prophet Joel. Now remember, you're supposed to hear these words through the ears of the people who stood there and heard them. They knew Joel. They knew about the prophet Joel. Many of them could have probably recited Joel by memory. Peter certainly did on this occasion. He'd been to synagogue school, and this is the way they learned it. He said, This is it. He says, It shall come to pass in the last days, saith God, I will pour out my Spirit upon all flesh. Your sons and your daughters shall dream dreams. Your young men shall see vision. Your old men shall dream dreams, and your sons and your daughters shall prophesy. You realize what this is saying? It says God's Spirit is going to be poured out on all flesh, and everybody of all age groups and both genders are going to be prophesying, dreaming dreams, telling God's Word, and so forth. He said, I'm mobilizing all the troops. But it's to happen, he said, in the last days. Now, it's funny thing about Peter is he seems to assume that these are the last days. And theologians are wont then to reorganize their thoughts around this and say, well, then the last days must have started with Peter and they've gone on for 2,000 years. I don't know about you folks, but that doesn't meet my common sense test. It just doesn't meet my common sense meter. Doesn't register anything on that at all. What does register is that Peter thought this was the initial act of those events of the last days. That's what he thought. And as he spoke to the people, in a sense it was, in the sense that this is what's going to happen at the last days. And he says, upon my servants and my handmaids I will pour out in those days of my Spirit, and they shall prophesy. And I will show wonders in the heaven above, signs in the earth beneath, blood and fire and vapor of smoke. The sun shall be turned into darkness and the moon into blood before the great and notable day of the Lord come. And it shall come to pass that whosoever shall call upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. Whoever. Now, of course, if you think this is the last day starting then you need to start looking around to the whosoever. But what's important to me about this is that what Peter has told us is that there is an eschatological meaning to Pentecost. There is a last days meaning to Pentecost. Pentecost is about the return of Christ. Pentecost is about the day of the Lord. Pentecost is about the fulfillment of prophecy. You can't just dismiss it and say, well, Pentecost pictures the Holy Spirit, and let's get on with the interesting stuff with trumpets and atonement. We have never really stopped to think about the end-time implications of the Feast of Pentecost. And you know something? One of the things this has caused us, I think, in times past to overlook some of the symbolism in the law that the Jews saw in one way, but the Christians should see in a totally different way. At the beginning, on day one, the first day of the weeks, the first of the first fruits was offered before God. The first one resurrected from the dead, the first one presented to Him, the first fruits of the dead, as He is one place called, and that tells us more than we could ever imagine. The first fruits from the dead was Jesus Christ. Because He is the first, that means there are more. And the 7 weeks leading down through those weeks, we are living probably in the 7th week right now of that time. I can't say for sure, but I would say probably we are. And at the end of the 7th week, the high priest went into the temple with 2 baked loaves of leavened bread and presented them to God. And I think it's possible that what we're seeing there is the resurrection from the dead and our presentation to the Father in the same way that Jesus was presented to the Father on the first day of the weeks. A little expression that because we haven't paid close enough attention or we've gotten involved in all the theological arguments, missed about the significance of this event to the early Christian church. The Sunday, during the days of unleavened bread or immediately thereafter, the days of unleavened bread, was very important to them. Not as a weekly thing, but because it was the first day Jesus appeared to them. It was the day Jesus was presented to the Father, and it took on an enormously important significance to early Christians. And I think it's one that should not be overlooked. And it has absolutely nothing to do with whether or not you observe the Sabbath day. Nothing at all. And so, the act that has to be done to make it possible to be presented before God in that resurrection time, there is something that has to be done. And it also is a part of this sermon. Whenever Peter had gotten through and convicted them all of their sins, he says in verse 37, they were all pricked in their heart, and they said to Peter and the rest of the apostles, men and brethren, what shall we do? And Peter said, repent and be baptized, every one of you, in the name of Jesus Christ for the remission of sins, and you shall receive the gift of the Holy Spirit. And elsewhere Paul will say, if that Spirit that raised up Jesus Christ from the dead be in you, it will also raise your body to be presented to God as Jesus was presented to God. 50 days have passed, and we can look forward with great anticipation to the real 50th day.